It began with a letter, a crisp white envelope. Tucked neatly beneath the wiper blade, a silver Ford pickup parked beside a small blue and white fishing boat. The note wasn't handwritten, but typed, precise, and almost sterile in its tone. Dear Mr. Lawson, per Article 7, Section 2B of the Pinewood Hills Homeowners Association bylaws, all boats must be stored out of public view. Failure to comply within 7 days will result in a fine of $150 per day. Sincerely, Janet Cole, HOA President. David Lawson stood by the shore of the still, glassy lake, coffee in hand, staring at the paper like it was a joke. He was a 55-year-old truck driver, broad-shouldered and sun-worn, with a kind of face that carried both kindness and exhaustion. For most of his adult life, he'd lived in motion, highways, rest stops, and midnight diners, until 5 years ago, when he decided he'd had enough of asphalt and noise. He found peace in Pinewood Hills, a gated neighborhood outside Salem, Oregon, where the air smelled like pine resin and wet earth. The community surrounded a small private lake, Lawson Lake, named after his great-grandfather, a logger who'd once owned the land before selling off parcels to developers. David never told anyone that the lake still legally belonged to him. Pinewood Hills was beautiful, but beauty came with a price, and a rule book. The Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining uniform aesthetics. That meant mailboxes had to be painted the same shade of cream, lawns trimmed no higher than 3 inches, and fences could only be 6 feet tall and visibly pleasant from the street. Behind that rule book stood Janet Cole, the HOA president, a woman who treated the neighborhood like a kingdom and herself as its reigning queen. She was in her early 50s with a perfect blonde bob, pearl earrings, and a pastel wardrobe that made her look more like a politician's wife than a suburban volunteer. Residents said she had that smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. To her, rules were sacred. And when she saw David's boat sitting beside his dock, a modest aluminum vessel, no more than 15 feet long, she saw not a man's piece, but a violation. When the first fine arrived, David laughed it off. He figured it was a mistake, some bureaucratic oversight. He called the HOA office, only to be met by Marla Jensen, the nervous secretary whose voice always trembled as if she were apologizing for breathing. Mr. Lawson, she said softly, I'm so sorry, but the board voted last week. It's not personal. Janet, It's a boat by a lake, David interrupted. What am I supposed to do? Store in my living room? I understand, sir, but the bylaws state that all boats must be stored in a covered facility when not in active use. You mean the lake that I own? Excuse me? David hesitated. He hadn't meant to say that. It just slipped out, a defensive reflex. But Marla's silence told him she didn't understand. She just worked there, caught between Janet Cole's authority and the residents' anger. Never mind, David muttered. Hanging up, that night, he sat by the water, listening to the frogs and crickets, the fine notice still in his hand. He thought about his late father, who used to say, don't let small people with small rules ruin big peace. But peace was already cracking. A week later, another letter arrived. Then another. Each one came with a new fine. $150, $300, for $150, until David owed nearly $2,000. The HOA added late fees, interest, and administrative processing charges, turning a petty nuisance into a siege. The tone of the letters shifted too, from bureaucratic to condescending. Compliance is not optional. Community standards must be upheld. Continued violations may result in legal action. David started noticing Janet's Lexus parked near the lake more often, her phone out, taking photos of his property from across the cul-de-sac. Once, she even brought Paul Hendricks, the HOA treasurer, a nervous man with thinning hair, who scribbled notes like a courtroom clerk. Neighbors whispered. Some sympathized. Others avoided him altogether. But one evening, while David was cleaning his boat, a small figure appeared. Toby Wells, a 29-year-old neighbor who lived 2 houses down, always filming things on his phone for his YouTube channel. Man, they're gunning for you, Toby said, nodding toward Janet's car. I saw her snapping pics again. You should see what they're saying in the Facebook group. I don't use Facebook, David grumbled. Well, good thing I do. Toby grinned. They're saying your boat's an eyesore and that it lowers property values. But guess what? I got it all on video. Her taking pics, writing notes, everything. David didn't know it then, but Toby's footage would later become evidence. By midsummer, Janet Cole had filed a lien against David's property, a legal claim that could eventually lead to foreclosure. That's when Officer Grant Meadows from the Maple County Sheriff's Department showed up. Grant was a steady man, mid-40s, compact build, light stubble, and that quiet authority that made people listen. He'd served in the Marines before becoming a cop. Pinewood Hills wasn't exactly a war zone, but in neighborhoods like this, politics could be more treacherous than combat. Mr. Lawson, he said, standing by the porch, I'm here on a civil complaint filed by your HOA. For what? Owning a boat. Grant glanced at the paperwork. Technically, for repeated noncompliance and unpaid fines. They're requesting property inspection. David exhaled, steady but simmering. You see that dock, officer? I do. You see that lake? Sure do. It's mine. Grant blinked. Come again. David disappeared inside, returning with a leather folder. Oh, worn, the edges frayed. Inside were yellowed land deeds, stamped in faded ink. My grandfather sold the land that became Pinewood Hills, David explained. But he kept the water rights. The lake and 15 feet of shoreline, in every direction. Every dock, every boat launch. Technically on my property. Grant looked stunned. You're saying the HOA is fining you for something you legally own? That's exactly what I'm saying. Word spread quickly. By the next HOA meeting, whispers filled the community center. Residents sat in folding chairs, clutching paper cups of lemonade, while Janet Cole stood at the front like a general before her troops. This association, she began, exists to protect property values and community standards. Mr. Lawson's alleged claims of lake ownership are being reviewed by our legal counsel. David sat in the back, arms folded, while Toby Wells filmed discreetly from his phone. Then, from the corner of the room, Lena Brooks, a local ER nurse and single mother, raised her hand. Janet, she said gently, if what he's saying is true, then the HOA has been finding someone on private land. That's illegal. Janet smiled. That politician smiled again. Mrs. Brooks, we appreciate your concern, but the bylaws don't trump state property law. Lena interrupted. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Janet's composure cracked for the first time. She looked toward Paul Hendricks, the treasurer, who was frantically flipping through documents. Paul, she whispered sharply, confirm his lot boundaries. Paul hesitated. I checked the parcel map. The lake area is exempt. It's not under HOA jurisdiction. Janet's voice dropped. That can't be right. But it was. After the meeting, Nora Klein, a local investigative reporter, showed up at David's door. She'd been tipped off about a property rights battle brewing inside Pinewood Hills. Nora had sharp brown eyes, a denim jacket, and a recorder always running. Mr. Lawson, is it true you're being fined for a boat on your own property? You could say that. Do you have documentation? David handed her the old folder, the same one his father had given him before passing away. The deed clearly stated, ownership extends to the body of water known as Lawson Lake, including all subsurface and surface rights, access, and maintenance privileges. Nora's brow furrowed. This means you could technically charge the HOA for dock access. Not my style, David said. I just want to be left alone. But by the time her article went live, HOA faces legal backlash after finding man on his own lake. The story had already gone viral. Suddenly, Pinewood Hills wasn't just a quiet Oregon suburb. It was a national spectacle. Janet Cole didn't take humiliation well. The morning after Nora's article hit, David woke to find his mailbox smashed and spray-painted with the words, "Sell your trash boat." Someone had also left dead fish scattered along his dock. Officer Meadows investigated, but found no witnesses. Could be kids, he said. But David could see the truth in his eyes. He knew this was organized harassment. Even some neighbors turned cold. Evelyn Marks, the HOA vice president, began holding informal meetings warning that David's legal stunt might threaten their property values. Paul Hendricks, guilt-ridden but spineless, avoided him entirely. Only Lena Brooks and her young son, Eli, remained friendly. She often stopped by with coffee after her night shifts, checking on him. "They're scared," she told him one morning. "Scared of losing control. You embarrass them. Didn't mean to." "Maybe not, but you did." She was right. It happened 2 weeks later. Just past midnight, David woke to the smell of smoke. He rushed outside, heart pounding, and saw the boathouse on fire. Flames clawed at the night, reflecting orange across the black water. He grabbed a hose, but it was useless. By the time the fire department arrived, the structure was gone, the dock charred, his boat a molten skeleton. Investigators found traces of accelerant, arson. Nora Klein showed up the next morning with her recorder. "Any idea who'd do this?" "I got about 12 names," David said quietly, "and they all live within a mile." The fire deepened the divide. Janet Cole issued a statement claiming sympathy, while insisting that the association bears no responsibility for individual property incidents. But to everyone else, it looked like retaliation. Officer Meadows launched an inquiry. He subpoenaed HOA meeting notes, financial records, and internal emails. What he found made his stomach twist. Hidden among the files were private discussions about David. Notes like, "If he won't comply, pressure him financially. Consider lien escalation. Perhaps stricter enforcement will encourage relocation." In other words, a campaign to push him out. When the sheriff's department questioned Janet, she was calm and calculated. "Mr. Lawson has been uncooperative since day one," she said. "The HOA simply enforced the rules fairly. As for the fire, we had nothing to do with that." But Officer Meadows wasn't convinced. He'd seen the emails, the tone, the vendetta. He also found something else. Large cash withdrawals from the HOA's discretionary fund, authorized by Paul Hendricks. When confronted, Paul cracked. "Janet told me to sign off," he confessed. "Said it was for community maintenance. But she used it for something else. I don't know what exactly." Paul's nervous fingers trembled as he handed over a folder of receipts, one showing the purchase of surveillance equipment, another for private security consultation. It wasn't just harassment. It was targeted intimidation. As the investigation deepened, another revelation surfaced. A decades-old document buried in the county archives, a covenant never updated when Pinewood Hills was developed. It confirmed David Lawson's ownership of the entire lake, including easement control, which meant every dock, every paddle boat, every scenic trail surrounding it technically required his permission. For years, the HOA had unknowingly trespassed on his property. Nora Klein's follow-up article hit the front page. HOA faces collapse after property rights revelation. The public turned. Residents who'd once sneered at David now demanded explanations. But Janet Cole refused to step down. "We will not be bullied by a man exploiting a loophole," she declared in a fiery meeting, slamming her hand on the table. "It's not a loophole," David said from the back. "It's history." The room fell silent. Within a month, half the board resigned. Paul Hendricks fled town, citing stress. Marla Jensen turned whistleblower, providing emails and recordings that revealed how far Janet's obsession had gone, even discussing legal harassment strategies. But before any charges could be filed, Janet vanished. She didn't show up to work, meetings, or her home. Her Lexus was found abandoned near a service road, a single shoe lying beside the driver's seat. Detective Laura Monroe from the county's Missing Persons Unit was assigned to the case. "Last anyone saw her," Monroe said, flipping through a notepad, "was 2 nights ago after a closed HOA board meeting. She seemed upset. Witnesses said she mentioned needing to fix everything before it's too late." The community froze. Had she run, been taken, or done something darker? Officer Meadows coordinated a search of the nearby woods. Dogs tracers sent toward the lake, David's Lake, before losing the trail near the burned boathouse remains. Divers were called in. For 3 days, they combed the murky waters, pulling up scraps of burned debris and a melted dock ladder. Then, on the 4th day, they found something. A cell phone, waterlogged but intact enough to recover data. It was Janet Cole's. Inside were dozens of saved messages, most to Paul Hendricks and Evelyn Marks. But one draft email stood out, never sent. If this gets out, it won't just be the HOA that falls. Coleman will bury us all. I can't keep pretending we didn't know about the dumping. Dumping? The word changed everything. It wasn't just about boats anymore. Environmental investigators uncovered that, years prior, Pinewood Hills developer, Coleman Environmental, owned by Arthur M. Coleman, had quietly redirected chemical runoff from a nearby construction site into Lawson Lake to save disposal costs. The HOA board knew. They covered it up to protect property values. And now, it seemed Janet was ready to confess, or had been silenced before she could. When Nora broke the story, it exploded across Oregon. Toxic secrets. The HOA cover-up in Pinewood Hills. The lake that had once symbolized peace now glimmered with betrayal. Late one night, Officer Meadows returned to the lake with a flashlight. The wind whispered through the pines as he followed the shoreline. He stopped by the charred remains of the dock, crouched, and noticed something half buried in the mud. A glint of metal. He dug it free. A gold bracelet. Engraved, J.C., the initials of Janet Cole. But just as he turned it over, he noticed something else. Faint tire tracks leading from the service road to the water's edge, fresh. He raised his radio. "Dispatch, this is Meadows. I need backup at Lawson Lake. We might have a secondary scene." Then, in the distance, across the black water, a light flickered, a single lantern glowing from a small rowboat, moving slowly toward the center of the lake. And in the faint beam of the moonlight, he saw a silhouette. Someone was out there, watching him. Officer Grant Meadows stood still, his flashlight trembling slightly as the beam danced across the black surface of Lawson Lake. The pale light of the moon caught ripples that widened like nervous whispers, and in the distance, that lone lantern moved slowly, deliberately, toward the lake center. "Dispatch, I've got movement on the water," he said into his radio. "Possible subject related to the Cole disappearance." Static crackled back. Then, "Copy that, Officer Meadows. Units en route. ETA 10 minutes. But 10 minutes was too long. The boat out there wasn't drifting. It was rowing. Purposefully. Meadows took a deep breath, stepped into David Lawson's small aluminum skiff that sat tied at the shore and untied the rope. The wood creaked under his boots. He pushed off, flashlight between his teeth, rowing slow and quiet. Halfway across the lake, the air changed, colder, heavier. The smell of gasoline and scorch would linger from the old boathouse fire. He aimed the light forward again. And there, maybe 30 feet away, the other rowboat stopped. The lantern inside it flickered. A voice, rough and low, drifted over the water. "You shouldn't be here, officer." Meadows froze. "Who's there?" "The lake doesn't like strangers." Then, splash. The lantern tipped, and the boat vanished beneath the surface. By dawn, backup had arrived, but the lake was still. No body. No boat. Only an oil-like sheen on the water, where the lantern had gone under. David Lawson stood at the edge, arms crossed, watching divers search. He looked older somehow, his eyes hollow from a sleepless night. "You sure you saw someone out there?" he asked Meadows quietly. "Positive," Meadows said. Voice was male, maybe mid-40s. "Not Janet Cole." "Could have been Coleman's people," David muttered. "Or one of the board members trying to clean up loose ends." Meadows nodded. "You've had anyone threatening you lately?" David gave a dry laugh. "Only everyone with a property line touching mine." A pause. Then he added, softer. "But no one stupid enough to kill over fines. There's something else going on here, officer. Something buried." And he was right. That afternoon, a car pulled up to David's cabin. A beat-up Honda Civic. Out stepped Marla Jensen, the HOA secretary. She looked terrified, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might be following. "Mr. Lawson," she said, wringing her hands. "I need to tell someone. I can't sleep." She sat at his kitchen table, eyes darting toward the window. "Janet wasn't a monster at first," she began. "She believed in the rules. But then Coleman came in with money, said the lake wasn't environmentally compliant, needed to be treated. He offered to help with a maintenance grant, but he used it to dump wastewater from his plant. She knew. We all knew. David's jaw tightened. How long ago? 3 years. We signed a confidentiality clause. Coleman promised no one would notice. But Janet found out the runoff was toxic. Arsenic, benzene, even traces of mercury. Marla's voice cracked. She wanted to come clean. Said she was going to record everything. Then she disappeared. David leaned forward. Record how? A flash drive. She kept it hidden somewhere near the lake. She called her insurance policy. David spent the next day combing the shoreline. The autumn wind bit his face as he checked under planks, rocks, tree roots, anywhere someone might stash something small. At sunset, his shovel hit something hard beneath the mud, near the burnt remains of the boathouse. A small metal box. Inside, wrapped in a melted Ziploc bag, was a blue USB flash drive labeled LAW file, the initials of Lawson Lake Watershed. He plugged it into his laptop inside the cabin. The folder contained hundreds of documents, invoices, email exchanges, water tests, and one audio file dated a week before Janet's disappearance. Her voice shaking. If anyone finds this, tell them Coleman isn't what he pretends to be. He's been paying the HOA to look the other way. And now, he says there's another shipment coming in. He said if I talk, I'll end up in the lake. David sat frozen. The sound of her last words echoed inside his skull. Then, something else in the background of the recording. The sound of waves and a man's voice, faint but distinct. It's too late, Janet. A splash. Silence. Nora Klein, the investigative reporter, drove up that evening after David called her. He showed her the flash drive. She listened, her face tightening with every second of the recording. This is huge, she whispered. This could implicate Coleman in environmental and criminal dumping and maybe even murder. We're not sending it to the press yet, David said. If they killed Janet, they'll come for anyone holding proof. You think they're watching you? I know they are. He turned his laptop around, showing her footage from Toby Wells' camera. He'd mounted it to watch the lake after the arson. In one clip, just 2 nights earlier, headlights appeared near the access road. A man stepped out of an SUV and walked toward the water carrying a duffel bag. They paused the video. The frame was blurry, but the face was visible enough to recognize the outline. Square jaw, silver hair slicked back. Arthur M. Coleman. The next morning, Officer Meadows stopped by again. His tone was quiet, but his eyes sharp. You need to be careful, he told David. Coleman's company's lawyer called the sheriff's office. They're claiming you trespassed when you dug up that drive. Trespass? David scoffed. On my land. They're saying you don't own what's below the surface, just the water rights. They're playing legal games. But more than that, we got word they've hired private security to patrol the perimeter. If they show up here, don't confront them alone. David nodded slowly. I'll keep my shotgun handy. No, Lawson. Meadows said firmly. You let me handle it. But by that evening, something else arrived before the law did. A white envelope taped to David's door. No HOA logo this time, just typed letters. Stop digging or you'll end up like her. Inside the envelope was a photo. The lake at night, taken from across the water. His own cabin glowing faintly in the distance. Nora convinced David to let her set up motion cameras around the lake. Toby Wells helped, eager to be part of something real. They installed 4 infrared cameras along the trails and one near the boathouse ruins. 2 nights passed quietly. On the 3rd, around 2:15 a.m., one camera triggered. A dark SUV parked by the access road. 2 men in black jackets got out, carrying flashlights. They walked straight toward the lake and began dumping something heavy wrapped in tarp into the water. When the footage was enhanced, you could see the logo on one man's sleeve, Coleman Environmental Field Division. Nora contacted Detective Laura Monroe, who'd been leading the missing persons case. We might have evidence of illegal dumping tied to Janet Cole's disappearance, Nora told her. Monroe arranged a warrant for Coleman's local operations site, but someone leaked it. When officers arrived the next day, the site was cleared. Hard drives wiped. Storage tanks gone. Coleman's office locked and dark. He'd vanished. Nora and David examined the flash drive again, searching for clues. Hidden in one of the subfolders was a password-protected file, labeled Project Hydrangea. David frowned. That's the name of the subdivision's first construction phase. They cracked the file using a recovery tool Nora's IT contact provided. Inside were PDF contracts, one showing the HOA had signed a 20-year maintenance partnership with Coleman Environmental for lake and soil treatment. But the chemical listed, ethylene dibromide, had been banned in the U.S. decades ago. Another document, dated 6 months before Janet's death, had Coleman's signature beside a note. Phase 2 injection approved. HOA to cover public liability. Ensure silence. The implications were staggering. Coleman hadn't just dumped runoff. He'd been slowly poisoning the lake to conceal industrial waste. And Janet Cole had found out. That same night, David woke to a sound outside, gravel crunching, footsteps on his porch. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the door. Nothing, just fog and silence. Then he noticed a small red dot on the wall across from him. Laser sight. He dropped to the ground as a bullet tore through the window. Glass exploded. Another shot, then another. He crawled to the kitchen, grabbed his phone, called Meadows. Shots fired at my property. Stay down. I'm on my way. The shooting stopped after 30 seconds. Tires screeched away into the night. When officers arrived, they found shell casings 9mm and fresh tracks leading toward the service road. But the shooter was gone. On the porch, pinned beneath a knife, they found another note. Stop digging, Lawson. You don't know what's under there. By morning, the sheriff's department authorized a full dive of the lake. Environmental teams wanted to test for toxins, while Monroe's unit was still searching for Janet Cole's body. For hours, divers scoured the murky depths. Then one of them surfaced, shouting. They'd found something, a submerged steel barrel, chained to cinder blocks. Inside, industrial waste sludge. And bones. Human bones. The medical examiner confirmed they belonged to Janet Cole. Inside her jacket pocket, they found a USB tag matching the same series as the one David recovered. Another drive, completely corroded but partially salvageable. Coleman's signature was engraved faintly on the metal. AMC. The story exploded nationwide. HOA president found dead in developer scandal. Toxic Lake murder case unfolds in Oregon suburb. Coleman Environmental stock plummeted. The EPA launched an emergency investigation, but Coleman himself still missing. Nora Klein appeared on local news, crediting David Lawson as the homeowner who uncovered a corporate cover-up. But David hated the attention. Reporters swarmed his driveway. Drones buzzed over the lake. Lena Brooks, the ER nurse, came by with her son Eli. She brought soup and quiet kindness. You didn't deserve this, she told him. Nobody does, he replied. Eli tugged his sleeve. Mr. Lawson's the lake bad now? David looked out the window. It's been bad for a long time, kid. We just didn't see it. 3 nights later, Officer Meadows received an anonymous call. A low voice on the line. You're looking in the wrong place. Check the tunnels under the lake. Click. The team discovered old stormwater maintenance tunnels running beneath the lake, part of the original drainage system. When they entered, the air smelled like rot and oil. At the far end of the main tunnel, they found more barrels, dozens of them sealed and chained. But one was different. Open, empty, and beside it, a chair with restraints. Detective Monroe whispered, "This wasn't just dumping. It's where they kept her before she died." The evidence suggested Janet had been interrogated, maybe tortured, before being weighted and sunk. David stood at the tunnel's entrance, face pale. All this under my lake. A week later, police traced Coleman's SUV to a private airstrip in Bend, Oregon. The vehicle was abandoned, but security footage showed him boarding a small jet bound for Belize. Interpol issued a red notice. But then, another twist. The plane never landed. It went off radar 30 minutes after takeoff over the Pacific. No wreckage was found. Coleman had vanished again. Rumors spread, Suicide, escape, or murder. Nora didn't buy any of them. Men like him don't disappear, she said. They hide. Meanwhile, the state declared Lawson Lake a toxic site. Cleanup crews arrived in hazmat suits. But under court order, they couldn't proceed without the owner's consent. David refused. No one's touching this lake until we know what else is under there. 2 months later, as winter settled, David noticed something odd near the north shore, a patch of ground that stayed thawed despite the cold. He dug there himself, driven by a gut instinct. A few feet down, he found a tarp. Inside were rusted tools, gloves, and a small metal plate engraved. Pinewood Hills Phase 2, property of Coleman Environmental. And beneath that, another skeleton. Not Janet this time. Smaller. Male. Dental records later identified him as Howard Kane, the original owner of Lot 19, who disappeared 5 years earlier after allegedly defaulting on HOA dues. The HOA had claimed he moved away. The discovery blew the case open again. Kane's death predated Janet's by years, which meant Coleman's operation in the cover-up stretched far deeper than anyone imagined. Inside Kane's old file, Nora found a foreclosure notice signed by both Janet Cole and Paul Hendricks. But Kane's son, tracked down in Portland, insisted his father had never missed a payment. They wanted his land, he said bitterly. He was the first one to protest the lake treatment. Next thing we knew, he was gone. The dots connected painfully clear. Coleman had been paying the HOA to silence dissenting homeowners. Those who resisted either lost their property or disappeared. Janet eventually tried to break free and paid the price. One night, as the wind screamed across the frozen water, David stood alone on the dock, staring into the black. He thought of Janet, of Howard Kane, of how many others the lake had swallowed. Then he heard it, faint, like a whisper under the ice. David, he froze, looked around. No one, just the creak of old wood and the hush of wind. Then again, clearer. It's not over. The ice cracked. A thin fissure spread outward from the center of the lake, releasing a deep gurgling sound like a breath. David stumbled back, heart pounding. He didn't believe in ghosts. But something about that voice chilled him in a way bullets never could. When Nora later reviewed the flash drive again, she noticed something new, a hidden encrypted folder that hadn't been there before. It appeared after plugging into her computer. The timestamp was recent. The folder's name, Coleman_still alive. Inside was a single image, grainy, from a security camera. Arthur Coleman, sitting at a cafe in Mexico City. The photo was dated 2 days ago. She called Officer Meadows immediately. He's alive. He's moving again. Meadows' voice on the other end was tense. Then this isn't over. He's tying up loose ends. You think he'll come back? Nora asked. No, Meadows said. I think he already has. That same night, Toby Wells, the neighbor who'd filmed everything, went missing. His car was found idling by the access road, door open, camera still recording. The last frame showed headlights behind him, then static. When Meadows and Monroe arrived, they found tire tracks leading toward the lake. Nora stared at the water, whispering, "He's back." And David, standing beside her, said nothing. The wind rustled the trees, and the lake, that cursed, silent lake, reflected the moon like an unblinking eye. 3 days later, a package arrived at Nora's newsroom. No return address. Inside, a waterproof case, a new USB drive, and a handwritten note. Part of the truth is still buried. The rest, you'll find where it began. Under the old boathouse. Bring Lawson. Alone. The USB contained a short video, filmed from a shaky camera. Coleman's face filled the frame. "You've all been digging in the wrong places," he said with that same calm, predatory smile. "The lake doesn't just hide bodies. It hides what's left of conscience." Then he leaned closer. "If you want to see how deep this goes, come find me before the next rain." The lake's rising again. The video cut to black. Nora looked at David, her hands trembling. "He's here," she whispered. "He's back." And as thunder rolled in the distance, the first drops of rain began to fall, hissing softly as they struck the poison lake that already claimed too many lives. The morning after the council meeting that left Maple Ridge buzzing like a shaken hornet's nest, the fog came early. It rolled down from the tree-lined slopes, spilling over the neat rows of identical mailboxes and wrapping itself around the silent houses, like a warning no one could quite decipher. Daniel Briggs woke before sunrise. The cabin felt colder than usual. His coffee steamed on the counter, untouched, as he stood barefoot by the window overlooking the lake. His lake. The water was calm, almost unnaturally still, reflecting the last faint traces of dawn. Somewhere across that mirror surface lay the subdivision that had tried to ruin him. And now, something darker was staring back. 2 weeks had passed since the explosive revelation that Daniel owned the very body of water Maple Ridge estates bordered. Evelyn Marks had resigned from the HOA after a flurry of community outrage and late-night phone calls from residents demanding her removal. Paul Hendricks had vanished from public life, his phone disconnected. But beneath the veneer of quiet, something ugly was brewing. Janet Cole, the HOA president, hadn't backed down. She had called an emergency executive board meeting, claiming there were environmental violations tied to Daniel's property. But Daniel wasn't naive anymore. He'd seen what power looked like when it was cornered, and Janet Cole was a woman who'd built her entire life on control. At 8:15 a.m., his phone buzzed. Mr. Briggs, this is Nora Klein with the Oregon Ledger. I understand you're the gentleman who's been in a dispute with Maple Ridge HOA. Would you be open to an interview? Daniel hesitated. Depends on what you want to hear. The truth, she said. And maybe what they don't want anyone else to hear. There was something steady in her voice, something Daniel hadn't heard in months. Someone willing to listen without already deciding he was a villain. By noon, Nora was sitting in his cabin, her recorder blinking red on the coffee table. Start from the beginning, she said, flipping open her notebook. The first fine. Daniel smiled faintly. You know, when it all started, I thought it was just a mix-up. $50 because my boat was visible from the street. I figured it was a form letter, something they'd fix once I explained it was on my property, my private dock. And then they doubled it every week. As he spoke, Nora's pen scratched furiously across the page. His voice carried years of frustration, the kind that builds slowly, like rust under paint. He told her about the meetings, the veiled threats, the night Evelyn Marks came to his cabin and demanded he comply with HOA standards. He described how she stood at the edge of his dock, like she was inspecting a foreign contaminant instead of a man's home. And then he told her about the night of the break-in. It had happened just 3 nights after the HOA confrontation, a cold March evening, wind shrieking through the trees. Daniel had woken to the sound of footsteps crunching gravel. By the time he grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch, whoever it was had already fled. But his boat, the one they claimed was an eyesore, had been cut loose. He found it drifting in the morning, half submerged near the reeds. I filed a report, he told Nora. Sheriff's office said it was probably kids, but the cuts on the rope were too clean. Professional, even like someone wanted to make a point. Nora's eyes lifted from her notes. Did you suspect anyone? Daniel didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. Then, Evelyn Marks, he said quietly, but not because she'd do it herself. She had someone else, her enforcer, Paul Hendricks. Over the next week, Nora dug deeper. What she uncovered made the earlier finds look like playground games. The HOA had been quietly diverting maintenance funds, nearly $60,000, into a community enhancement account controlled by a private contractor. The contractor's name? Coleman Environmental, the same company that had once tried to buy the lake rights from Daniel's father 30 years ago. Arthur M. Coleman, the CEO, was known statewide for his polished charm and ruthless negotiations. He had his fingerprints on dozens of suburban developments, each beginning with beautification and ending in aggressive property acquisitions. Nora's instincts screamed conflict of interest. And Janet Cole? Her full name, Janet Coleman, Arthur's sister. Word spread fast. By mid-April, the entire neighborhood was divided. Those who wanted to side with the HOA for stability, and those who wanted answers. Daniel, for his part, stayed out of it, or tried to. But when anonymous letters began appearing in his mailbox, crude threats written in block capitals, warning him to sell or pay, the fear turned to fury. He walked into the Maple County Sheriff's Office and placed every letter, every photo, every report on Detective Laura Monroe's desk. "Enough's enough," he said. "They've been trying to push me off my land for months. Someone's got to stop them before it gets worse." Detective Monroe, a methodical woman known for her patience and persistence, took the file. She promised to look into it. But 2 nights later, the lake itself caught fire. It started with a flash. Witnesses in Maple Ridge reported hearing a low boom just after midnight, followed by a glow rising over the tree-line. Daniel's boat dock was engulfed in flames. By the time fire crews arrived, the dock and his shed were gone, reduced to blackened timbers and ash. The blaze had been deliberate. Traces of accelerant were later found in the water, chemicals often used in landscaping fuel storage. Daniel watched the smoke curl into the night sky, numb. He knew what this was. They were sending a message. The investigation gained momentum after the fire. Detective Monroe cross-referenced the HOA's contractor invoices and discovered that Coleman Environmental had recently purchased bulk quantities of the same accelerant found at the scene. When she confronted Janet Cole, the woman was unflappable. "Sheriff, you're making a mistake. My brother's company handles hundreds of properties. You can't possibly think." Then explained the shipment. Monroe interrupted. It was billed to Maple Ridge Estates. Janet's confident smile faltered. But before a warrant could be filed, Coleman's lawyers descended, stalling, delaying, drowning the investigation in paperwork. Nora's article hit the papers anyway. The headline burned across the front page. HOA, corporate developer linked to lake arson in Maple Ridge. The community turned. Residents started protesting at the HOA office. Evelyn Marks, who had been hiding in her home since the scandal broke, was found attempting to shred files when police arrived with a search warrant. She broke down in tears, whispering the same thing over and over. "I didn't want to do it. He made me." Under questioning, Evelyn revealed what many had suspected. The HOA had been under quiet pressure from Coleman Environmental to encourage Daniel Briggs to sell his land, the lakefront property that blocked Coleman's planned expansion project. Fines, harassment, sabotage. It had all been part of a campaign to wear him down. But what none of them expected was what came next. Evelyn's confession led to a storage unit rented under Paul Hendricks' name. Inside, investigators found a file labeled Project Redeem, blueprints, environmental assessments, and a letter bearing Arthur Coleman's signature, authorizing demolition of the Briggs property and construction of a Coleman Resort and Marina. The start date? May 1st, 2 days away. When the sheriff's office informed Daniel, he didn't say much. He simply stood, walked to the window, and stared at the lake. "I guess it's time they remembered who owns the water," he murmured. The next morning, he filed a lawsuit, not just against the HOA, but against Coleman Environmental, citing unlawful intimidation, trespassing, and arson. He also filed a cease and desist order preventing any further development near his property. The case made headlines statewide. TV crews lined the edge of the county courthouse as Daniel arrived, flanked by his attorney, Avery Brooks. In court, Avery's opening statement was simple. They thought they could take everything from him. They forgot, you can't drown a man who owns a lake. After 3 weeks of testimony, the truth was undeniable. The HOA's board members were found complicit in an organized campaign of harassment. Coleman Environmental was fined heavily and forced to withdraw from all local development projects pending criminal review. Janet Cole resigned in disgrace. Evelyn Marks received probation for cooperation. Paul Hendricks, who had fled Oregon, was later found in Nevada and extradited to face charges of arson and conspiracy. When the gavel fell, Daniel didn't cheer. He just exhaled. For the first time in years, the lake was quiet again. Months later, Daniel rebuilt his dock, not as a monument, but as a reminder. He placed a single sign at its edge: private property and peaceful waters. Nora's documentary aired that fall, turning the Maple Ridge scandal into a national conversation about HOA power and property rights. Detective Monroe was promoted for her persistence, and Daniel, reluctant hero of a battle he never wanted, found himself invited to community panels and interviews about justice, corruption, and courage. He always said the same thing. They didn't just try to take my land. They tried to take my peace. But peace isn't something you can find a man for. A year later, a new envelope arrived at Daniel's mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photo, grainy, black and white, of the lake at night. In the reflection of the moonlight, a single motorboat drifted silently across the surface. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible, were two initials scratched into the image's border. AC. Arthur Coleman. The story of Daniel Briggs wasn't just about fines or property rights. It was about how far power will go when it feels threatened, and how truth, once exposed, has a way of echoing louder than intimidation. Maple Ridge Estates recovered. Eventually, new neighbors moved in. The lake grew still again, its glassy surface reflecting the slow healing of a community once poisoned by greed. But for Daniel, every sunrise over the water carried a quiet reminder that justice isn't a destination. It's a battle fought every time someone refuses to bow. He often said to Nora, when she'd visit with her camera and coffee thermos, "People think the worst part was losing the dock, the boat, the money. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing how cheap humanity gets when greed puts on a uniform." And as the credits roll in her documentary, Daniel's final words echo like a quiet question to every viewer. If they came for your peace, your home, your freedom, would you stand your ground? Or would you let them fine you until you forgot who you were?